Number 300 for Marcus Holman. The Cannons power play strikes again, and that is history for number 1.
Yeah, it's incredible. I'm blessed so many ways. Got to be able to share this with him. I don't think Mark. This is a coach talking, not his dad. I don't think Mark gets anywhere near the credit he deserves. He scored 300 goals as being a professional, and you never hear his name mentioned in that. But he doesn't want it that way. He's a grinder, and he's a tough lacrosse player, and he loves this game as much as anybody else. So just really proud of him.
All right, what's up, guys? Welcome in Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. I want to get into this episode. I need to vent a little about the Atlas or lackluster performances as of late. If you guys have listened to the podcast in the past, you know by now that I am an Atlas fan, so I do want to vent a little bit about their recent performances and sort of just the concerns that we're starting to see with this Atlas team. And it's things that I've gathered from Atlas fans both on Twitter and on Discord as well, mixed in with a few of my thoughts and a few of my concerns, obviously, as well, but we'll get to that in just a minute. We'll also, as we always do, get to your thoughts, your comments a little bit later on, and I will touch here in just a second to start things out. Before we get into that Atlas discussion, I will touch on the picks from this past weekend and recap a little bit of my fantasy roster as well. But that first audio you heard to open the show just a moment ago was the call of the 300th career goal of Marcus Holman's career. That second bit of audio that followed it was from Cannons head coach and Holman's dad, Brian Holman, talking about just being able to be that moment and share that moment with his son during that game the other night, and to be a part of this now in that discussion, in that 300 goal, because he definitely not necessarily all that much about it's just high level he's been able to, and just kind of enjoying those like that together the other night. But to get into kind of great overview, but from Friday, where I did say I did expect a nice game this weekend after struggling against the Atlas, he did just that, had 33 fantasy points in week 4, fantasy points, 1 from 3 points in that game against the Atlas with 2 goals and 2 assists. And then in the picks, overall, not too shabby, 6-6 overall in the picks on, and above this in past seasons too, more so than any other year that we've experienced. Nobody really knows anything, so when you have these making their predictions, things like that, such as what we do here on the podcast, nobody really has a statistic to back up before somebody tries to tell you that they know a thing. I think it's safe to say at this point that they're going to be wrong, because there's just so many crazy outcomes of these games. Like, I don't think too many people in the fashion that they did. And again, that's something that here in just a moment we'll get into. But like I said, one of the biggest points to get into was talk about the disappointment that I've felt the Atlas team. Again, if you guys have followed the podcast, you know that I'm an Atlas fan. Started at the draw, they took Adler, they took Makar with those top 3. One premier defense in this draft. They were 2 of the top players overall in this draft. It makes sense using both of the 3 picks on that position in part. Had players that were high, that went in the picks following that in the first round. Could be one of them at that number 3 pick, and maybe hindsight being 2020. The general Atlas fan have liked them to take that possibly number 3. I find a few people that would say so. And I'm not mad at number 1 and number 3, but then I think following it up, Raphorst was definitely a head scratcher, not a move that I think many people would have seen coming, even making those 2 picks. So I think kind of those 2 guys in the top 3, and then letting go of Cade Van Raphorst kind of put some. Then you see the kind of performance that this defense, not necessarily just from those 2 in specific, but the defense, I think, as a unit in general, just the lack of fundamentally sound we've seen from this team over the past game and a half or so, dating back to week 3. Lack of fundamentation, just guys not really understanding where they're supposed to be at certain times. They're kind of overextended. They're supposed to be here in that in between, so to speak. And when I say fundamentally lacrosse coach, and for the past couple of years in coaching has coached at grade level, one of the biggest things, a young defense, pretty simple, but one of the biggest things that I preach to them in terms of defense is don't be at the younger levels like that third and fourth. They want to swing the stick around. They want to hit people with it, and have to talk about getting their hands on his hip, giving him that little push hip, and getting control of his body, being able to turn him that sort of that control. Then you start throwing those lifts and those pokes and things like that. I've been seeing, especially the other night in the Cannons game, that I think especially a lot of times it's been happening with their long poles, especially, is they're kind of graders not to do, which is they don't move their feet all that well, it seems like at times, and they're guys just running, getting to the cage, which gives them really good looks on Kincannon, right? Especially the other night has not been, like I said the other day on the podcast, the defense has essentially been doing him absolutely no favors. But again, like I said, he hasn't been really helping the situation as of late either. But it's just, again, that lack of fundamentally sound defense that has really been hurting them lately, and it's that lack or just poor communication by this Atlas defense. But another thing that I think we saw in a big way on Saturday night against the Cannons is the lack of adjustments. And this is probably another key concern that I have, along with that lack of fundamentally sound defense that I just talked about, is the lack of adjustments by Mike Pressler and this coaching staff in game. And they even talked about it late in the broadcast on Saturday night. Granted, I only watched until about the 6 or 7 minute mark of the fourth quarter. Admittedly, I just had enough because I just couldn't watch it anymore, but I turned it off. They did actually talk about on the broadcast, they didn't understand the way in which the Atlas won the faceoff, because at this point, we basically know you're going to win the faceoff. Like, that's almost a guarantee at this point with how automatic Trevor Baptiste has been at the stripe this season. So you're pretty much guaranteed to win the faceoff. But when he's winning it back to himself, back to his defensive half of the field by 10 or 12 yards in order to win it, that's fine. The problem is it takes time off the clock for him to do that, where he's backtracking and now has to bring it back across midfield. So you're taking the time off the clock just to get it over the midline. Then you got to get it into the offense, get it to the midfield, get it to the attack, what have you, and then make your substitutions to get guys on and off. And by the time they're done doing that with that 32-second shot clock, they're really initiating their offense under 10 or 12 seconds on the shot clock. One good look at the cage. If you're lucky, they were even struggling at times against weeks ago. Were struggling to eat. They talked about they did sort of do a variation night, but what they talked about doing on the broadcast was putting an offensive midfielder, whether it be Brian Costabile or it be Romar Dennis, somebody that is more of an offensive midfielder but can also play on the defensive end. Having one of those guys on the defensive side of the field so that when Baptiste wins this off back to himself, he just kind of flips it to them. They run it over midfield, and now Baptiste is free to run off pretty quickly after winning the faceoff. And then you get your long pole is going to be on the side of the substitution box already. So all he has to do is kind of jog off the field. You get your other midfielders on and you kind of roll with it that way. And what they ended up doing on Saturday was, I believe it was Jake Richard they had back there doing it. And I want to say it was around that time that Quint Kesnick mentioned it on the broadcast. And maybe it's because he saw Jake Richard kind of initiating things off the face-off in that similar situation that he kind of brought it up. But it kind of begs the question that, okay, if you're sitting on your couch at home like I was the other night watching that game, and I can even come up with something like that along those lines and kind of taking that idea and running with it to where you have Baptiste winning it back to somebody like Costabile or Romar. You have your long pole on the wing by the box side, and you have maybe somebody like Jake Richard or Peter Dirth or Danny Logan, whoever the case may be, one of those short stick D mids who are more than capable for even 10 or 15 seconds or so of filling an offensive midfield spot. if you can sit there on the broadcast or sit there at home watching the game on TV and saying, why don't they just do that? Why don't they pull one of their long pulls off the field? They drop a midi down to defense. You win the face-off back like he does 99% of the time, especially the other night against the Cannons, and just kind of roll with it that way. Then you have a better opportunity to sub on the fly, and it doesn't take you 15 to 20 seconds in order to do it. Instead, it takes you about 5 to 10 seconds, and now you're ready to roll. You're into your offense, and you can get better quality looks on the cage. So again, it's the lack of fundamentally sound defense. It's the lack of adjustments being made. And like I said too, I think Kincannon, especially the other night, didn't do the defense too many favors either, and had his issues the other night as well, because he got beat, I think, more than twice on the short side on some shots that 90% of the time or so you would probably expect him to make those saves. So at this point in the year, I think it's just a lot of things are broken on that side of the field. A lot of things are broken with the defense in terms of the communication and guys understanding, okay, do I need to be here? Do I need to be here? What's my assignment if the ball goes here? And, how are we going to play this? And just playing better fundamentally sound defense than what we've been seeing from them the past game and a half or so. And it kind of begs the question, what needs to be changed? Is it a roster shakeup? Is it more of a schematic adjustment? We talked about the lack of adjustments just now. Or is it just that focus on fundamentals? Or is it some combination of the two? Do you need to change things up in the midfield? Do you need to change up the way that you game plan in the midfield and kind of schematically placing guys around the field in order to maximize, as somebody said, I believe it was on Discord, maximizing the face-off potential that you've been getting from Trevor Baptiste this season? Because really what they're doing is they're wasting it. Like, yeah, his numbers look good in fantasy, but what is it doing for you on the field? How is it translating to success on offense and dominating time of possession and things like that? Because there was a point in the game on Saturday night, he was dominating the face-off, but the Cannons were dominating in time of possession and touches. So again, it's maximizing what you're getting from the face-off, and right now it kind of feels like they're doing the exact opposite because of their putrid defense, because of their inability to adjust on the fly and to make adjustments at the face-off to where you can maximize your possessions on offense and not be getting into your offensive sets with 10 or 12 seconds to go on the shot clock. It's little things like that I think you're really starting to notice with this team, but it's the little things that are just killing them in such a major way. And you just wonder how much longer that this is going to go on. And another thing that I've started noticing, especially the other night, and somebody either said it on Twitter or on Discord, but I read it somewhere. Somebody asked if Brian Costabile just looked absolutely gassed the other night in the second half of that game. And it got me thinking, is it just me, or is Mike Pressler only playing one line of offensive mids? Like, he does have Xander Dixon there most of the time on the game day roster. He had Justin Gutterding there the other night on the active roster, but is it just me, or is he only pretty much exclusively playing Costabile and Romar and then insert other midfielders name here on that primary offensive midfield line? Like, these guys are going to get gassed, and I think you saw evidence of that the other night. Like, you have Costabile and Romar primarily playing both ways a lot of times, especially in transition opportunities where you can't sub them off. So when you're asking them to do that for 4 full quarters of a PLL game, like, these guys are going to get gassed if you don't have guys behind them that can come in for a shift or two here and there and just give them a break. I mean, even the short stick D mids, like, those guys get a ton of run during the games as well. Like, but you at least, obviously, because there's only usually 1 or 2 of them out there at a time, you have more of an opportunity to rotate those guys through. But again, it goes back to that whole schematic adjustments. Why is he primarily just playing those 2 or 3 same midfielders every single time they have the ball? Like, I get it, they're probably your best options at this point, but again, you have to give those guys a breather once in a while, especially if you're asking them to play both ways. So another final point that I want to get to, I do want to hit somebody's comment that they gave me on Discord. I thought it pretty much summed up everything that this segment really is about. But my other thing too is, I had my concerns about Romar Dennis in the past, even prior to this season and even before really this game this weekend. But he really, I think, showed me something in this game on Saturday. I mean, he played pretty hard on the defensive end of things when he was asked to be a defensive mid in transition situations alongside Costabile. Like, I really feel like he held his own at the defensive end of things. Of course, it's easy to do that when you're 6'5" and 230 pounds, but I think he also showed me a little something offensively too. Like, I had some concerns about him in the Water Dogs game. I didn't really see a whole lot of effort from him on the offensive side of things in that game. And it kind of got me worried because, okay, if you're going to be a primarily 2-point shooter and you're just going to hunt twos all day, if you're not really succeeding at doing that, then it's almost like, what good really are you at that point? But again, I think he had some really nice looks in that game the other night against the Cannons, cashed in on a couple, even hit a 2-pointer in that game. So again, he did show me a little bit of something of what I think we need to see more of from him going forward. And if this thing continues to spiral out of control for the Atlas this season, could Romar, if he continues that level of play on the offensive end, could he potentially be a trade piece for a playoff team who's in the hunt for a championship this year, whether it be the Redwoods or the Archers, two of the teams that are near the top of the PLL standings as it currently stands? Could you see him get moved later on this summer, considering that he's only signed through 2023? But like I said, I did want to get that comment from the guy on Discord, from Ryan James on Discord. He says, I think to say that Pressler has struggled to adjust to the pro game, this far is quite fair. Adjustments to capitalize on Baptiste's face-off dominance have been non-existent. Letting go of CVR was a massive mistake, and then the team has struggled with its defensive strategy despite their high ceiling. Offensively, he's been slow to move away from players that are having inconsistent or minimal production. The Cannons are much improved, but on paper, this result should not happen. Two new coaches, being Pressler and Holman, have had vastly different effects. Holman is clearly using a system that gets the most out of his players. Pressler is the opposite. So like I said, to sum it up in maybe a few sentences there, just as Ryan James does, I feel like that really just embodies what Atlas fans and myself included are really feeling at this point in the year. Is you have these coaches, guys like Nat St. Laurent, you've got guys like Brian Holman, they're adjusting to that 32-second shot clock and they're finding ways to use it to their advantage. If you're the Atlas and you have Trevor Baptiste, you have the ultimate advantage right there on your team, a guy that's winning probably 80% of his faceoffs at this point in the year, and you're doing absolutely nothing with it. And that's the concern if you're Atlas fans, is that lack of adjustments to having, like I said, to having that ultimate weapon in terms of possession, and then also just the lack of fundamentally sound defense that we've seen. So finishing up the show here in just a moment, we'll get your thoughts, your comments in the mix, recapping Week 4 in the PLL. You're listening to Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Welcome back. Final segment of the show here on a Monday, recapping Week 4 in the PLL, getting your thoughts, your comments in the mix to round things out. At Stevie Mac Media is my Twitter handle. You can hit me up there for all show related topics and discussion around the PLL. From Michael Ramirez, good friend of the show, he was actually the one, believe it or not, an Atlas fan himself, that kind of gave me the idea for doing that topic in segment 1 around the Atlas. If you missed that segment or any part of that segment, hit that rewind button wherever you listen to the podcast and go back and check that out. And also let me know your thoughts, whether you're an Atlas fan or not. I mean, this does apply to fans of other teams as well. Let me know what your thoughts on the Atlas through the first 4 weeks of the regular season are. But from Michael Ramirez, he says, Atlas continue to disappoint, but much respect to Marcus Holman joining the 300 club and counting. Where does his legacy stand? Archers found the solution at faceoff, and that should scare the league. Who's winning the Brennan O'Neill sweepstakes? So yeah, just a couple things. Like I said, we let off the show with that audio of Marcus Holman getting his 300th goal. Now sits at 301, I believe it was, he finished with. And we heard his head coach and dad's thoughts on that following the game as well. Talked about how he never really gets into a lot of that stuff. Marcus does. He never really thinks about being in that 300 club or really what that means. It's more just about playing the game and playing it to the best of his abilities. And now he's been around the professional level, obviously, for a little while. And then he says, where does his legacy stand? Again, I think anytime that you can be sort of in that exclusive club, that 300 club, it does kind of put you in a group of very highly thought of guys that are either current Hall of Famers or future Hall of Famers. And I think now that kind of puts him in that discussion of being a future Hall of Famer himself. He says the Archers found a solution at faceoff, and that should scare the league. Yeah, in the past, I mean, they've always been, at best, I would say they've been pretty mid at face-off throughout their history in the PLL, but now it does appear that they found the answer there in Sisselberger, and he's starting to make his impact on this team, being able to get the ball to that offense a little bit more. And I mean, they looked absolutely fantastic the other day. In that game against the Whipsnakes, even without Grant Amon at attack. Matt Moore had a really nice game, had a hat trick in that one. I'll talk about him in just a minute with one of these other comments that we had here on Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. But yeah, I do think that this year they do have a different team, they being the Archers. In the past, I always felt like Chris Bates was kind of that coach where he does less with more. I mean, you look at the firepower that he's had on that Archers offense in the past, guys like Manny, Holman, Amon. You had Connor Fields in the mix a couple of years ago. You have Schreiber, guys like that. Like, that was an absolutely all-star, all-pro, whatever you want to call it, lineup that they had, but just could never turn it into a deep run in the postseason for whatever reason. Maybe it did have something to do with their struggles at the face-off when it came playoff time, but I do feel like this could be the year, especially with a team like the Whipsnakes that seems down this year, and the Chaos are kind of where they've been the last couple of years, right around 500, and then they kind of make that late season move and make that push towards the playoffs. But yeah, this does feel like a different Archers team. Dobson in the cage has been really good for them this year. Again, like I said, Sisselberger's been a difference maker for them, and that offense hasn't slowed down really at all from what we've seen in the past. So could this be the Archers team that finally gets over that hump and does actually compete for a championship this year? We'll have to wait and find out, but I do think that this looks like the team that could get that done. And he says, who's winning the Brennan O'Neill sweepstakes? Presumably a number 1 overall pick in next spring's draft, or at least probably will go top 3. I think currently you're probably looking at a team like the Chrome or the Atlas, unless the Whipsnakes keep falling. But, you know, how dangerous would that be if the Whipsnakes got their hands on Brennan O'Neill? I mean, that would just be ridiculous for the rest of the league. But you're probably looking at currently, I would say, either the Atlas or the Chrome, just because the Chrome have their issues on offense, the Atlas have their issues on defense. If one of those two can kind of figure those problems out and right the ship the rest of the way, could have an opportunity to rebound pretty well the rest of the way. But again, if not, you're probably looking at a top 2 or 3 pick in next spring's draft. So from Chromeback 2023, he says the most impressive and most disappointing team, surprise individual performance, MVP through week 4, and which of the 1 and 3 teams has the most reason to panic, with 7 to 8 teams making the playoffs, still plenty to play for and time to figure it out. Yeah, and that last point that he makes about the 7 of 8 teams making the postseason, so still plenty of season left to play out. That's kind of what I just said with the Chrome and the Atlas. Yes, you do have your problems on offense. If you're the Chrome, they're anemic offensive issues that they've had the last couple of games. You still have time to figure that out, and if you can, you still have some games that you can make up some wins and still make that push for the postseason. And if you're the Atlas, again, just making those adjustments on defense, kind of getting back to the fundamentals and figuring out how you're going to capitalize off your dominance at the face-off stripe are going to be some things that they have to figure out for both these clubs moving forward. And I think for a team like the Cannons that I talked about a couple weeks ago, you only had to go 4-4 the rest of the year to get in that 4-6 or even 5-5 range. And since then, you're 2-0. right? You started out the year 0-2, and since I made those comments a couple weeks ago, they're now 2-0 and looking like one of the hotter teams in the PLL right now, along with the Redwoods and along with the Archers. So I do think that if they continue this and the offense continues clicking, the defense, we're starting to see guys like Cade Van Rapport start having their effect on that defense. And they're really doing better, I would say, for the most part on face-off. But I think just continuing to get better, and especially some of their younger guys like Matt Campbell, who had a pretty good offensive game the other day against the Atlas, although I guess who didn't in that game the other night. I think I saw somewhere the Cannons on Twitter said they had 7 players register 2 goals or more in that game. So just an unreal offensive performance from them the other night. But I think if they just continue doing what Brian Holman said a couple weeks ago, and they just keep progressing week in and week out and just staying on track, they will get to where they want to be by the end of the season. And I do think that if they keep this little winning streak going, they could be one of the hotter teams, as I said, in the PLL. But going back to what he said, most impressive and most disappointing team from this weekend. Again, I think most impressive, you probably are looking at a team like the Archers, or you're probably looking at a team like the Cannons, because it's not just the fact that the Cannons beat the Atlas for the first time in PLL history, but it's the way that they did it and the fact that they really dominated that game for 3 quarters, because it was a pretty close game after the first quarter, but from then on it was basically all Cannons after that. So it's not just the fact that they won that game, but it's the way that they did it, just absolutely pouring in buckets left and right offensively. Like I said, 7 players, they said, had 2 goals or more in that game. Just an unreal offensive performance. So most impressive, I'd probably say the Cannons, and on the flip side, I'd probably go the other way and say the Atlas were the most disappointing, or you could say the Chrome were most disappointing too, because again, another just really poor offensive performance from them, even with the insertion of Brendan Nichtern into that lineup. He says, surprise individual performance. I think there was a couple this weekend, believe it or not. I think Austin Caught with 16 saves, kind of getting the start out of nowhere. We all just kind of assumed it was going to be Blaze Reardon, because why wouldn't it be? But he comes in and gets 16 saves out of nowhere. Matt Kavanaugh had 7 points in that game against the Atlas the other night. Cade Van Rapport, against his former team, had 3 ground balls and a caused turnover that night. And Matt Moore, I mentioned him a little bit earlier on in the show, had a hat trick on the day against the Whip Snakes. He says, MVP through week 4. I mean, it's got to be Ryder Garnsey to this point in the season, right? Like, nobody's putting up the kind of numbers and the production that he is currently in, and is really showing no signs of slowing down. And I even tweeted this during their game the other day. He is going to be, just a little disclaimer here on the podcast, he's going to be in my fantasy lineup from here on out until further notice. Like, until we see that there is somebody on this earth that can slow down Ryder Garnsey, he's going to be in my fantasy lineup from here on out. And I think that that's a safe play for anybody that's playing along with PLL fantasy here this season. And then he says the team with the most panic going forward. And I'd say, again, it's probably a team like the Atlas because of their struggles on defense and not being able to maximize Trevor Baptiste on the faceoff, or it's a team like the Chrome where you've seen a guy like Brendan Nichtern come back, and yeah, he did make some plays for them offensively the other day, but again, just another really poor performance from them offensively, where they've tried moving some guys around in the lineup. They've brought in some other guys to try and help out, but it just hasn't really paid dividends yet. You haven't really seen that difference in output just yet. So I'd say probably the Atlas, but I'd say a close second for which 1 and 3 team has the most to panic about right now. Probably close second would be the Chrome. And then finally from Brian on Twitter, he says, we need more Jeremy Thompson and the native perspectives on the broadcast regularly. That's something that they did this weekend with the games. It was their native heritage weekend. They had the specialized jerseys for that. They also brought in, as Brian says, they brought in Jeremy Thompson to the broadcast to kind of give his perspective on things. He says the face-off is here to stay, and the Archers absolutely have a championship team and are a real chance. And yeah, I talked about the Archers with one of the comments previously, saying how this is probably their best chance this season to go and compete and win a PLL championship. I just feel like they have all the right pieces in place. They've got a really stacked offense. They've got a guy that can change the game at the face-off stripe, and they've got a goalie that through the first 4 weeks of the season has largely been a brick wall in Brett Dobson. So yeah, I definitely think that this is their time to shine, and this is their time to go compete for a PLL championship. But going back to his thing about Jeremy Thompson, I did enjoy hearing him on the broadcast, and he even admitted during the last game of the weekend, hey, this is the first time I've ever done something like this, but this is a lot of fun. I really hope the PLL brings me back and allows me to do this again. And yeah, I'd say from a broadcaster's perspective myself, for somebody that does college lacrosse games, I thought he did just fine. I thought that he brought a lot of really good insight to the natives' perspective about the game and the way that they treat it and the mindset that they have towards it, and different traditions and things that they carry with them, and really just how it impacts their everyday life as well. I thought, as Brian points out, getting that perspective from him, but also the fact that he's played with many of these guys in the PLL, or he's played with them on the national level or against them on the national level, but he's familiar with these guys in a pretty big way. So having that perspective as well, and those insights on these athletes in the PLL, I thought was a big plus for the broadcast. So that'll do it for this episode of Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Make sure to like, comment, and share on this post. Let me know what you think about that Atlas discussion we had back in segment 1. You can also find the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, including Google, Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and now Amazon Music as well is in the mix. But that'll do it for me. I'll talk to you guys later.